Hello and welcome to our Edge Sports and Football Outsiders Divisional Round Preview. I'm Ian O'Connor, and once again I'm joined by Edge Sports co-founder Frank Frigo, Football Outsiders editor-in-chief Aaron Schatz, and Edge Sports senior data scientist Scott Brown. We're down to 8 teams in the NFL, and each conference's top seed is back in action after a first-round bye. But before we get into this weekend's games, we'll take a quick look back at last weekend's games. And we can't talk about the Super Wildcard weekend without talking about two huge coaching decisions. First was Mike Vrabel's decision to punt on 4th and 2 from the Ravens' 40-yard line, down by 4 with about 10 minutes left in the game. Frank, what do you make of this decision?
Well, this was one of the most talked about decisions of the weekend, and Vrabel really bungled this. We did a pretty deep analysis on it. This cost them pretty close to a 14% GWC game winning chance. This was a real clear error by Vrabel. It was very costly, and he needed to do better in a big game like this.
Yeah, and like you said, I think people are still talking about this one here. 2 days after the game, it's been nonstop. But that same day, later that night in the Pittsburgh game, Mike Tomlin made a similarly bad decision. After coming back from a 28-0 first quarter deficit, the Steelers trailed by only 12 at the start of the fourth quarter. Having had the whole break to think about it, with his offense in a groove and being 2 for 2 on fourth downs on the night, he still chose to punt on 4th and 1 from his own 46-yard line. Now, the raw magnitude of this error wasn't as big as Vrabel's, but it was a pretty big chunk of their win probability, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. And again, when we talked about this game in the preview last week, we mentioned how Tomlin can be very unpredictable. You know, sometimes he seems like he gets analytics, sometimes he doesn't. This was a head scratcher. They clawed their way back, but at a crucial moment, he gives up what in absolute terms was about 3% in win probability, but it was a large chunk of what he had available. He went from about 13% down to about 10%. So this was surprising. You know, right when his team was feeling like they were back in it, he pumped the brakes.
Yeah, that's one thing I would say about this decision. There was a lot of discussion on Twitter and on the broadcast about the concept of momentum. And that's something that analytics has always had an argument with, the idea of momentum in football, that means something, that feeling that you have the momentum with you is actually going to lead to you making plays. But if that does exist, Mike Tomlin went and squandered all the momentum by punting this ball. Like, if you do believe in the argument for momentum, the argument for momentum would say Pittsburgh had the momentum, go for 4th and 1.
Absolutely. And like I mentioned, they were 2 for 2 already. They were pretty much in fourth down go territory. Seemed like every time after the first quarter, because they were so low in their win probability, that it was a no-brainer. I think pretty much everyone thought he was going to go for it, but he didn't. But now onto that performance side. You mentioned momentum. Pittsburgh was playing very well. So what was it, Aaron, that stood out to you or surprised you the most from the entire Super Wildcard weekend from that standpoint?
I mean, that's what is the most surprising thing, was how bad the Pittsburgh defense was and how good the Cleveland offense was. You can't give Cleveland offense credit for Roethlisberger's interceptions. You can't give the Cleveland offense credit for the blown snap early in the game. But still, the Cleveland offense played its best game of the year and didn't shut it off in the second half. They had something like a 75% offensive DVOA just in the fourth quarter. So Cleveland just kept bringing it the whole game on offense. And that stood out to me. The other thing, Baltimore, after their defense had declined in the second half of the year, had a really strong defensive game against Tennessee. And that also stood out.
Yeah, really big weeks from both of them. And if you're Cleveland, you know, you're ending one of your biggest rival, if not your biggest rival season, as well as potentially Ben Roethlisberger's career. You know, no one really knows if he's going to be back. So that could have been the end for him at the hands of the Cleveland Browns, a team that he's pretty much dominated his whole career. And now jumping into this weekend's games, we'll start with Saturday's first game, the Rams at the Packers. Jared Goff didn't start, but came in early when John Wolford left the game after a big hit to the head. Goff did enough to win the game with help from a defensive touchdown, but they were tied for the third worst offensive performance of the week. Now, Aaron, do you expect Sean McVay to stick with Goff, and what do you expect from a Packers defense that's seen improvement in the second half of the season?
Well, it's interesting because he doesn't want to look like he's benched Goff for Wolford. But the fact that he started Wolford last week suggests he'd rather play Wolford. So I have a feeling he's going to go back to Wolford and get that running ability that Goff doesn't have. But either way, the Rams offense has really declined in recent week. They were 20th on offense, DVOA, since week 10. And so that's a real decline, even though their defense has been the strongest in the league over the last few weeks. And that defense now has to face the Green Bay offense, which has been number one in the league for most of the year, either 1 or 2 with Kansas City, finished the year number 1. Not only Aaron Rodgers having an MVP-like season, Davante Adams, probably the best receiver in the league this year, but their offensive line has been the strongest in the league. Their offensive line is number 1 in both ESPN's pass block win rate and run block win rate. And you do not want to have to go up against an offensive line that good when Aaron Donald has a rib injury.
And another factor in this game could be weather. It's a game in Green Bay in January, and sometimes it seems Aaron Rodgers plays even better in the cold, especially at Lambeau Field. So does this give Green Bay a significant advantage, especially considering Goff's thumb if he even plays, or is weather not really as big of a factor as many perceive it to be?
I would say it gives them a small advantage, but not a significant one. There definitely is a history of dome and warm weather teams struggling in the cold in December and January, but it's not as big as people generally make it out to be.
Yep, and you mentioned the matchup between that Rams defensive line and the Packers offensive line. I think the matchup I'm most looking forward to is Jalen Ramsey against Davante Adams, so we'll see how that one turns out. And now, Frank, we didn't see any – sorry, go ahead.
The Rams are the number 1 defense in the league against deep passes. So when they try to hit Marquez Valdez-Scantling downfield, that's going to be tough.
Yep, so we'll wait and see. That'll, like we said, is one of the more exciting matchups of the games this weekend, I think. But, Frank, we didn't see any big errors or fourth down goes from Coach McVay last weekend. Overall, it was a pretty mundane game for the Rams as far as decision-making goes. Meanwhile, Packers coach Matt LaFleur was our coach of the year this season. So how do you see things shaking out between these two?
Yeah, there's a pretty big discrepancy between these two coaches. When we look across the entire season, McVay didn't fare very well. In our critical call index, our CCI, he ranked 29th. And as you mentioned, LaFleur was our coach of the year, was 3rd in the CCI. So you're never quite sure in these games what type of opportunities or difficult fourth down decisions they might encounter. But if they do arise in this game, you would have to give the nod to LaFleur for sure.
Yeah, I mean, each of these coaches has one of the biggest errors that we've seen this season. Sean McVay had I think, over 18% error in week 1 against the Cowboys at the end of the game. Matt LaFleur had one that was very similar, over 18%, I believe, as well against the Jaguars. But I don't anticipate either one of them making a decision that big. But like you said, if it is, we'd probably lean towards McVay making that big error just based on where he finished in our CCI rankings. And now, Scott, this was probably the game last week talking about the Rams that had the biggest question mark surrounding it pertaining to their quarterback situation. So what are we seeing this week in the markets after Goff played pretty much the entire game last week?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. There's a lot of question marks heading into this week's game as well for the Rams. Right now, Green Bay is favored by a touchdown. The total for the game is 45.5. Obviously, you highlighted the fact that it has the potential to be a cold weather game, potentially snow. So that seems to be a pretty fair market at this point. Right now, we lean ever so slightly towards the Rams. It'll be interesting to see how their injury situation pans out, both with Goff at quarterback, whether or not they go with him or they stick with him or they go with Wolford, as well as Aaron Donald. Aaron mentioned his rib injury, and he actually left the game at the point he was injured and did not return. So I think we all expect him to play, but is he hampered at all by that injury? And certainly, if there's any defensive player in the league that could affect the lines, Aaron Donald is the guy. So it'll be interesting to see if this game moves at all from the 7-point status that it has right now, and we'll definitely be monitoring that as the week goes on.
Yep, and last week you mentioned Goff was worth, based on what you saw in the markets, worth about 3 points. That's 7 points that you're looking at right now. Does that, you think, take into account the fact that people think Goff is going to play, or is it the opposite?
To be honest, I really don't know. We sit, pretty early in the week right now on Tuesday, so we haven't really had a lot of opportunity to observe line movements. I think there's a lot of uncertainty there that still has to be determined. Even if Goff plays, he's obviously dealing with a broken thumb in cold weather. So, who knows if gripping the football becomes a challenge. And so we'll really have to, I think we look at this line pretty humbly. there's a lot of uncertainty, and we really don't have a very strong opinion about that game, but we do lean ever so slightly in the Rams' direction to cover.
So it sounds like that's probably going to be the line to watch this week of all the games, just based on that uncertainty there. And now, while part 3 of Tom Brady versus Drew Brees on Sunday is deservedly receiving a lot of the hype, it's Saturday's night game that may be the most anticipated of the weekend. And once again, it involves the Ravens. Baltimore shut down Derrick Henry last week, and Lamar Jackson rebounded from a rough start and gave us one of the plays of the weekend, if not the entire season. Then Josh Allen and the Bills had one of the better offensive performances last week, but Buffalo was 3rd worst defensively against the Colts. So, Aaron, what are you looking for in this one?
Yeah, this is definitely the closest game of the weekend, I think, and it should be a really good one. Buffalo is number 1 right now in weighted DVOA, but Baltimore is 6th. Now, what's interesting is the Baltimore offense has improved a lot in recent weeks, ranking 6th in the league in the second half of the year. And their defense, like I said earlier, had declined and ranked only 18th in the second half of the year, but did have a fantastic game against Tennessee. A couple of other matchups I'm looking for here. Buffalo's offense on first down is number 1 passing, but 29th running. Now, we talked about Baltimore and their ability to shut down Derrick Henry. So Buffalo is going to really want to pass the ball on first downs, not run the ball. Also, one place where the Baltimore offense can really take advantage of the Bills' defense, passing on first down, the Bills' defense is only 26th, while the Baltimore offense ranks 5th. So I know the Baltimore offense is built around the run, but instead of going run, run, pass, it might make sense for them to go pass, run, pass, or maybe even pass, pass, run, and do what Buffalo doesn't expect.
And Lamar Jackson did it all last year, coming into the season as the reigning MVP. And you mentioned Aaron Rodgers having an MVP season, but Josh Allen is one of those. He could sneak in and take that from Aaron Rodgers this season. We expect it to be Rodgers, but Allen is having a phenomenal year. So we've got a great quarterback matchup in this one. And now, Frank, as you discussed in the beginning, Mike Vrabel did the Ravens a huge favor last week. And John Harbaugh made a great 4th down go decision, though that conversion did get called back on a penalty. Sean McDermott also had a pretty good 4th down go decision that Buffalo converted via Colts penalty. So based on their finish in our coach rankings, this seems to be a pretty even matchup, wouldn't you say?
It does. So Sean McDermott finished 8th in the CCI. Harbaugh was 2nd in the CCI. So both performed really well throughout the season. Harbaugh's been there before, shown that he can make the right critical calls in difficult situations. It'll be interesting to see how McDermott performs under, in such a big game. I would give a slight nod here to Harbaugh, but as you mentioned, I think this is these are 2 solid coaches, and I wouldn't expect either one to give up much.
Absolutely, and it's close in the coaching matchup. As Aaron mentioned, it's close overall, closest game of the week. And now, Scott, at Open and last I checked, this was the closest game of the weekend in terms of spread. Are things still looking that way, and is there anything else you've seen on this one?
Yeah, you're right, Ian. Right now, Buffalo is favored by just 2.5 points. There's a 50-point total in the game. And based on what we're looking at with our model, this game looks to be completely in line. We really don't think there's really much edge to be had on any of the major betting lines. The total looks pretty fair. The line looks pretty fair. All signs point to this being a very evenly, matchup that we expect to make a very good game.
We'll see if Baltimore can steal yet another one on the road. And now moving on to Sunday's games, the day kicks off with probably the biggest surprise matchup of the weekend, unless you're in Cleveland. The Browns get back their head coach Kevin Stefanski and all-pro guard Joel Bitonio for this one most likely, as well as cornerback Denzel Ward, among others. Now, with that being said, they'll still face what might be their toughest test of the season against the AFC's top seed Chiefs, who are well rested after their first round bye. These teams last played in 2018 when Baker Mayfield was a rookie and Patrick Mahomes was in the midst of a monster MVP season. That one ended in a 37-21 Chiefs victory. Aaron, do you see a similar outcome this time around, and what are the main factors that will influence the outcome in this one?
I wouldn't be surprised if there's even more scoring this time around, because these 2 teams are the 2 worst defenses left in the playoffs, but they're both really good on offense in recent weeks. Now, I don't need to tell you about the Kansas City offense and how good they are, but the Cleveland offense, since week 12, if you take out the game where they didn't have wide receivers because of COVID restrictions, In their other games, their offensive DVOA has been 32.8%. That would be better than what Kansas City did over the entire year. So these offenses are both just as high as you can imagine. Now, the problem for Cleveland is that there are certain defensive weaknesses that they have that are exactly the wrong weaknesses to have against Kansas City. They are 29th in the league against deep passes. They are 29th in the league against the pass on third down. And they're 28th in the league against tight ends. And those are all weaknesses you do not want to have against Kansas City. And when you put that together with the advantage from having the bye week, and we all know Andy Reid has a particularly good record coming off of bye weeks, I really think Kansas City is probably the biggest favorite of the week.
And with that being said, really any weakness that you have against Kansas City is pretty bad. You don't really want to have any weaknesses going into a game with them because they're just that good. Now, Frank, the Browns didn't really need to go for it on fourth down much last week after getting out to a huge lead. They actually had no fourth downs where we recommended they go for it. I imagine that will change this week in a game that most expect them to trail. And we mentioned last week that Stefanski was one of the better coaches in the league, and he'll be facing Andy Reid, who finished second in our coach rankings the last 2 seasons. So if you're looking for a game with plenty of aggressive fourth down decision-making, this seems to be it, doesn't it?
This could be it, yeah. So Stefanski finished 5th in the CCI. Reid finished 6th in the CCI, which speaks specifically to these in-game decisions, these fourth downs. Reid's been there before. He's shown he will do it in the big game. It'll be interesting to see. As you mentioned, Stefanski didn't really have any challenging decisions. That's one of the advantages of getting up 28-0 in the first quarter. But this could be a very different game. So we'll see, how he performs compared to what he did throughout the season. But it feels like there's not much of an edge there for either one of these two in this matchup.
And now, Scott, I have no doubt this is the most one-sided game of the weekend, like Aaron mentioned. But just how much do the markets favor the Chiefs? And with Cleveland and Kansas City being the 2 worst defenses left in the playoffs, like Aaron mentioned, they're probably expecting a lot of points, aren't they?
That's right. So right now, Kansas City is favored by 10.5 points, by far the biggest margin in any of the games. And the game also features a 56-point total. That's an eye-popping total. As Aaron highlighted, 2 terrible defenses, 2 high-powered offenses. We expect there to be a lot of points in this game. In fact, after consulting the edge model, we really think that there's an edge to be had betting the over in this game. And we also like Cleveland taking the points.
Yep, and one more note on this one, which you've probably heard of by now, considering that high-powered offense of both of these teams, is Mayfield and Mahomes met in 2016 in a Big 12 showdown for the ages. It was a 66-59 Oklahoma victory. Baker Mayfield threw for 545 yards and 7 touchdowns, while Mahomes threw 88 times for 734 yards and 5 touchdowns, and he added 85 yards and 2 scores on the ground. So nobody's betting on a repeat of these numbers, but like Scott alluded to regarding the total, do not be surprised if this is the highest scoring game of the weekend. And speaking of high totals, Tampa Bay and New Orleans come in as the second highest, also over 50 points, I believe. And while the quarterbacks are in the later stages of their careers, offenses led by Tom Brady and Drew Brees are still more than capable of putting up plenty of points. But while the Buccaneers' offense was second best among wildcard teams against one of the league's top defenses in Washington, the Saints turned in a below-average performance against the Bears. Now, maybe some of that Nickelodeon slime slowed them down, but should we be worried about New Orleans moving forward, Aaron?
I'm a little worried about the New Orleans offense. The New Orleans offense has put up DVOA below 0 in 2 of its last 4 games since Drew Brees came back. Tampa Bay has not put up an offensive performance below 0 since the Week 9 blowout when they lost to New Orleans. I believe the score of that game was 38-3. This is a matchup of our 2 best teams from the entire season, not the best teams in our weighted ratings that take down the strength of the early season games. But if you look at the full season, we had New Orleans number 1 and Tampa number 2. And it's interesting that the over-under is high because these are 2 very strong defenses as well as 2 very strong offenses. However, I think the Saints, it's the part of the problem they're having passing is third downs because they're so dependent on short passes that you can sit on their stuff going to the sticks on third downs. They only ranked 25th in third down passing in the regular season. And even if you remove the Taysom Hill games, they only improved to 19th. However, they're second rushing on third downs. So when it comes to those third and mids, like 4, 5, and 6 to go, they may actually be better off running the ball with Alvin Kamara rather than passing it.
Yep, and we mentioned the high total there, and you mentioned that blowout 38-3 that New Orleans had in the first game of the season, which actually was in week one. It was a 37-24 victory, I believe, for the Saints. So the high total there, while it may be a little surprising, is not exactly out of reach, like you've said. And now, Frank, we talked last week about Sean Payton falling way behind when it comes to decision making, and we saw a couple big errors from him this weekend, both 4th and 4 punts in Chicago territory. Had that game been against a better opponent, those really may have cost him. Will come in the Buccaneers. Do you think Sean Payton will be a little bit more aggressive in this one, or will he stick with his kickers?
He's hard to predict. I mean, sometimes, as we mentioned last week, he can do some things that you might not expect. But he finished bottom of the list this year, 32nd on our CCI rankings. Arians was 30th. I don't see really an advantage here for either one of these coaches. And it didn't bite Peyton in a game like the Bears where they had a distinct advantage, but we'll see. But I don't really see an edge for either one.
Yeah, and like we mentioned with the Buffalo-Baltimore game and the Kansas City-Cleveland game, got coaches that all rank very highly in our CCI ranking with what we expect could be a lot of fourth down decisions to go for it. In this one, don't be surprised to see a lot of 4th and short punts and field goals. So, Scott, in addition to this one being the second highest total, as we mentioned, last I checked, it was the second closest as well. So we did see the home team favored in each of these first two matchups, but New Orleans did cover in both games. So where is the line sitting this time around? Where do we have this one? And can you tell if bettors are expecting the Saints to cover a third time?
Yeah, so right now, New Orleans is favored by just 3 points. The game has a 52-point total. And as you highlighted, New Orleans won both and covered both of the regular season matchups. Those matchups are slightly different in that there was no Michael Thomas, who's back in action now in the playoffs. After consulting the edge model, we do like Tampa Bay's position in this game, taking 3 points. We definitely like that side of the matchup. We actually slightly favor the under in this game. I know this may seem counterintuitive as the game's an indoor game, two high-powered offenses. But Aaron also highlighted the strength of the defenses. There are two very, very, very good defenses. And so we give a slight edge there to hitting the total, to going under the total. And we expect it to be a very tight matchup between two really good teams. And it'll be interesting to see if Tampa Bay is able to redeem themselves in this matchup.
Yeah, and Scott, you mentioned Michael Thomas is back in this one. He was back last week, had one of his biggest games of the season. I believe it was his first touchdown of the year as well. So we'll see if he and Drew Brees can keep that connection going this time around. And now it's time for us to make our predictions once again. So Frank and Scott are currently tied for the lead after correctly picking 4 of last weekend's 6 games. And like last week, we'll start with the first game of the weekend. So Aaron, we'll start with a spread pick and then who you think is going to win overall in that Los Angeles Rams and Green Bay Packers game.
I'm going with Green Bay, both straight up and against the spread.
All right, Frank, how about you?
I'm with Aaron on this one. Green Bay straight up and the spread.
Scott, you in agreement?
Yeah, I'm joining the party. I like Green Bay both against the spread and straight up, sort of bucking the recommendation of the model. I just think there's too much uncertainty surrounding players in this game. It'll be a fun one to watch.
I'm also going to take Green Bay against the spread and straight up. One thing I do remember if Goff plays is a couple years ago, I think he threw four interceptions against the Bears in Chicago in that cold weather. So I think if he plays, he'll even struggle a little bit again this time. And now moving on, Baltimore and Buffalo, like we said, the closest game of the week. Aaron, what are you thinking on this one?
I'm going to ride with my numbers, and my numbers love Buffalo. So I'm going with Buffalo both straight up and against the spread.
How about you, Frank? Baltimore's your Super Bowl pick, so you sticking with them?
I'm going completely the opposite. I like Baltimore on both fronts. Yes, on both.
Yep. And how about you, Scott?
Yeah, I'm on Buffalo, both against the spread and straight up. I expect it to be another really, really close game between two really good teams.
Yeah, and as hot as the Bills are, I know they're number one in the weighted DVOA right now, but I'm going to have to go with Baltimore. I think Lamar Jackson and that team are just on a roll right now, and they're going to head off to the AFC Championship. Now, Cleveland at Kansas City. Like we know, this is a one-sided game. So, Aaron, I think I know who you're taking again this week when it comes to this, a big favorite, but who you got?
I've got Kansas City to win this game, but I'm going to go with Cleveland to cover the spread because Kansas City, I believe, set an NFL record this year by winning while not covering the spread 8 different times. And their ability to just constantly play close games, I'm going to kind of go with that as a possibility and suggest that there's a good chance of Cleveland covering this game. Whether it's a close game or a backdoor cover, that 10.5 line is awfully favorable.
How about you, Frank?
Well, 10.5 is a lot of points, but I think Cleveland is just, they're not going to make it up. I like the Chiefs to win and to cover.
All right, and Scott?
Well, you heard Aaron. I like the points he brought up. I like Cleveland to cover in this game, but I do like Kansas City to win it.
And I agree. I'm going to take Kansas City to win it, and I think Cleveland is going to cover. I think, before even Aaron mentioned, I think it's going to be a backdoor cover within the last 90 seconds of the game. So we'll see how that one goes, but I'm going to take Kansas City overall to win that one. And then the last game of the weekend, Tampa Bay and New Orleans. Like we said, it's part 3 of Tom Brady versus Drew Brees. Aaron, who you got in this one?
This is a tough one for me because these are my 2 top teams. I've been riding New Orleans all season since the preseason. I'm going to take New Orleans to win, but even though the line is small, Tampa Bay to cover. I think that the difference between these teams is that small that I would, if given 3 points, I would rather take Tampa Bay than New Orleans. So New Orleans to win, but Tampa Bay to cover.
Frank, how about you?
New Orleans to win and to cover for me.
And Scott?
I'll take Tampa Bay against the spread, but New Orleans to win it.
Yep, and I'm going to go the opposite. I'm going to take Tampa Bay to win it. So Tampa Bay against the spread and to win the ball game. I think Tom Brady is going to get that first victory this year over Drew Brees and the Saints. And now, I don't know about you guys, but this is probably my favorite weekend of the NFL season. We've got 4 more games, all of which typically seem to be some of the best matchups of the season from my standpoint. So I can't wait to see how these games shake out. Thanks for joining me again this week, guys. Enjoy one of our last few precious weekends of NFL action, and we'll see you back here next week for our conference championship weekend preview.